The grand ballroom of the Mills mansion gleamed under crystal chandeliers, a testament to Derek Mills' excessive wealth. Modern art pieces worth millions lined the walls, each carefully selected to showcase the host's refined taste and deep pockets. Derek Mills himself stood at the center of it all, a tall man in his 50s wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that cost more than most people's monthly salary. As he guided a group of influential guests through his newest art acquisitions, his voice carried across the room with practiced authority. This piece, he gestured to an abstract painting, was acquired at a private auction in Monaco. Only 3 collectors worldwide were invited to bid. He paused, allowing his words to sink in, watching his guests nod appreciatively. Among the bustling servers in black and white uniforms, Amanda Clark moved with purpose, her eyes taking in every detail of the room. She carried a silver tray of champagne flutes, navigating between clusters of wealthy guests with practiced ease. Unlike the other servers, she wore a simple but elegant black dress. She was, after all, technically a guest tonight, though Derek's invitation had come with clear undertones of mockery. The other servers, many of whom Amanda supervised daily as head of household staff, shot her questioning glances. They knew something was different about tonight, but couldn't quite figure out what their colleague was planning. Amanda's expression remained neutral, professional, even as she heard snippets of conversations that made her stomach turn. In a corner near the imported marble fireplace, Derek gathered with his inner circle, CEOs, hedge fund managers, and old money heirs. Their laughter carried a sharp edge as Derek leaned in, lowering his voice but not enough to prevent Amanda from hearing as she passed nearby. "I thought it would be amusing," Derek said, swirling his aged scotch, "to have our help join us for once. You should see her face whenever she looks at the art collection. Like a child in a candy store she could never afford." His friends chuckled, the sound carrying the distinctive note of privilege unchecked by conscience. Amanda's hand tightened slightly on her serving tray, but her steps never faltered. She'd anticipated this, had prepared herself for worse. As she approached the kitchen doors, she caught her reflection in one of the many mirrors adorning the walls. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, "Stand tall, baby girl. Your dignity isn't theirs to take." In the relative quiet of the kitchen, Amanda took a moment to steady herself. She thought about her family's journey, her grandmother who'd worked as a maid in the segregated South, her mother who'd put herself through night school while raising 3 kids alone, and now Amanda herself, with a college degree and management experience, even if some only saw her as the help. The kitchen staff bustled around her, preparing more hors d'oeuvres for the wealthy crowd outside. Amanda checked her phone quickly, seeing a message that made her smile slightly. "On my way. Let's show them what real class looks like." The text was from Veronica Lee, and its arrival sent a surge of confidence through Amanda's spine. She straightened her dress, checked her makeup in her compact mirror, and took a deep breath. The night was young, and Derek Mills had no idea what he'd set in motion with his supposedly clever invitation. Amanda had spent years working in this mansion, observing these people, learning their ways and weaknesses. Tonight, she wouldn't just be observing, she would be participating in a way Derek never anticipated. As she pushed through the kitchen doors to return to the party, Amanda's mind was clear. She'd heard Derek's comments, seen the smirks, felt the weight of their dismissive glances. But unlike what they assumed, these things didn't diminish her, they fueled her resolve. The party was just beginning, and soon they would all understand that underestimating her had been their biggest mistake. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted perceptibly when Veronica Lee made her entrance. Unlike the calculated, fashionably late arrivals of other guests, her timing was precise and purposeful. She stood in the doorway for a moment, commanding attention in a deep blue designer suit that spoke of power rather than mere wealth. At 52, Veronica had built her tech empire from scratch, and every movement reflected that hard-earned confidence. Heads turned as she moved through the crowd. Derek's regular guests recognized her immediately. Veronica Lee, CEO of Innovatech Solutions, recently featured in Forbes for her company's groundbreaking AI developments. Her presence at any event automatically elevated its significance, and several guests immediately began maneuvering to get closer to her. Derek, still holding court near his prized artwork, faltered mid-sentence as he spotted her. This wasn't part of his carefully orchestrated evening. His eyes narrowed as he watched Veronica scan the room, clearly looking for someone. When her gaze landed on Amanda, who was professionally managing the beverage service, an understanding smile passed between the two women. The connection wasn't lost on the other guests. Whispers began circulating immediately. A prominent venture capitalist leaned toward his colleague, muttering, "Did you know Veronica Lee was connected to Mill's staff?" The question carried implications that made Derek increasingly uncomfortable. Veronica made her way through the crowd with deliberate grace, accepting brief greetings but clearly headed in a specific direction. When she reached Amanda, she didn't hesitate to embrace her warmly, a gesture that caused several nearby conversations to stop abruptly. "Amanda, dear," Veronica's voice carried just enough to be heard by those nearby, "thank you for the invitation. I wouldn't have missed this for the world." The emphasis on invitation was subtle but clear. Amanda wasn't just attending, she had the power to extend invitations to one of the most influential women in tech. Derek quickly tried to regain control of the situation, moving toward them with practiced charm. "Veronica, what an unexpected pleasure. I wasn't aware you knew my..." He paused, carefully choosing his words, "my household manager." Veronica's smile remained pleasant but took on an edge. "Oh, Amanda and I go way back. In fact, she's been instrumental in several of my company's diversity and inclusion initiatives. Her insights have been invaluable." She turned to include several nearby guests in the conversation. "Did you know she has a master's degree in organizational psychology?" The revelation landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the gathering. Amanda maintained her professional demeanor, but now stood straighter, no longer playing the role everyone had assigned her. Several guests who had previously ignored her presence suddenly found themselves reassessing their assumptions. During the cocktail hour that followed, Amanda and Veronica strategically positioned themselves near a group of influential board members. The conversation naturally turned to corporate culture and workplace dynamics. Amanda spoke with authority about modern management practices, while Veronica added weight to her points with real-world implementation examples. Derek watched from across the room as his carefully constructed social hierarchy began to crumble. He saw one of his closest friends, the CEO of a major banking corporation, earnestly discussing recruitment strategies with Amanda. Another guest, a woman who had earlier laughed at Derek's jokes about his staff, was now hanging on Veronica's every word about the importance of diverse perspectives in executive positions. The power dynamic had shifted so subtly yet completely that Derek felt like he was standing in a funhouse mirror version of his own party. Everything looked similar on the surface, but the underlying reality had transformed. His attempt to humiliate Amanda by inviting her to mix with his elite circle had backfired spectacularly. As the evening progressed, more guests gravitated toward Amanda and Veronica. Their corner of the ballroom became the center of genuine, engaging conversation, while Derek's usual holding court over sycophantic admirers felt increasingly hollow. The contrast was stark: substance versus show, authentic discussion versus superficial small talk. Veronica caught Amanda's eye across a group of engaged listeners and gave her a subtle nod. Phase 2 of their evening was unfolding perfectly, and they were just getting started. The real revelations were yet to come. The conversation deepened as Amanda began sharing her family's story, her voice steady and clear in the now attentive ballroom. She stood near one of Derek's prized sculptures, but the artwork no longer commanded attention. The real masterpiece was the narrative unfolding in front of the guests. "My mother worked 3 jobs, Amanda said, addressing a captivated group that included several Fortune 500 executives. She cleaned houses during the day, worked as a hospital orderly in the evenings, and still found time to study nursing on weekends. She didn't just teach us about hard work, she showed us." The weight of her words hung in the air, making several guests shift uncomfortably in their designer clothes. Among the listeners was James Morrison, one of Derek's closest friends and the CEO of a major investment firm. He had been quiet throughout Amanda's story, his expression thoughtful. Earlier in the evening, he had laughed at Derek's jokes about the help. Now, he kept glancing at his own reflection in the gilded mirrors, as if seeing himself differently. "When I was 12, Amanda continued, my mother collapsed from exhaustion. She had been working 36 hours straight to cover for a sick colleague. The hospital where she worked as an orderly treated her, and then promoted her to a nursing assistant position after she recovered, because they had seen her studying medical texts during her breaks." She paused, letting the implications sink in. They saw her potential when others only saw her position. The silence that followed was broken by James Morrison clearing his throat. "In 20 years of running my firm," he said slowly, "I've never once considered recruiting from our support staff for management positions." He turned to face Derek, who had been hovering at the edges of the group. "Derek, how many of your domestic staff have advanced degrees?" Derek's face reddened. I don't typically inquire about their educational backgrounds. 3 have master's degrees, Amanda answered calmly. 2 are working on their bachelor's degrees at night, and 1 is a certified public accountant who couldn't find work in his field due to. She paused meaningfully, various systemic barriers. Veronica stepped forward, seamlessly building on Amanda's momentum. When I started my company, she said, I was often the only woman in boardrooms. More significantly, I was frequently the only person of color. The assumptions people made about my capabilities were. She smiled diplomatically, interesting. A woman in the group, wearing a Chanel suit and several carats of diamonds, leaned forward. Did you face direct discrimination? The discrimination is rarely direct these days, Veronica replied. It's in the subtle dismissals, the interrupted conversations, the assumptions about how you achieved your position. Her eyes met Derek's briefly. It's in the social invitations that come with hidden agendas. The group absorbed this, and James Morrison spoke again, his voice carrying across the room. My firm handles billions in investments, but our entire executive team looks exactly the same as it did 20 years ago. We talk about diversity in our annual reports, but what actual changes have we made? The question hung in the air like an indictment. Other executives in the group began sharing uncomfortable glances, perhaps mentally reviewing their own company demographics. Derek's attempt to interject was lost as more guests joined the conversation, drawn by the authenticity of the discussion. A prominent board member of several Fortune 100 companies raised her hand slightly. Veronica, would you be willing to consult with my organizations about implementing effective diversity initiatives? Not just for show, but for real change. Before Veronica could answer, 3 other executives had made similar requests. Amanda watched as the very people who had dismissed her hours earlier now scrambled to demonstrate their commitment to change. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she recognized genuine awakening when she saw it. Through it all, Derek stood increasingly isolated, watching his carefully cultivated social ecosystem transform before his eyes. His usual allies were now engaged in serious discussions about corporate responsibility and systemic change, leaving him without his usual audience for self-aggrandizing stories about his latest acquisitions. The momentum was building, but Amanda and Veronica exchanged knowing looks. This was just the foundation, the real challenge to Derek's worldview was still to come. As the conversations about diversity and inclusion gained momentum, Derek attempted to redirect attention by announcing the unveiling of his newest art acquisition. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention. His voice, usually commanding, seemed to falter as only a few guests turned his way. Rebecca Chen, a prominent business journalist from the Wall Street Journal, had been silently observing the evening's events from a corner of the ballroom. Her notebook was already filled with observations, and her fingers moved swiftly across her phone's screen, documenting every significant exchange. This wasn't the standard society page story she'd expected to cover tonight. Mr. Morrison, she called out to the investment firm's CEO, would you say this evening has changed your perspective on corporate recruitment practices? Her question was precisely timed, cutting through Derek's attempted distraction. James Morrison straightened his tie, aware that his response would likely appear in print. I've spent the last hour learning that one of my closest friends' employees has better qualifications than several of my senior managers. It's not just a perspective change, it's a wake-up call. Derek tried again to intervene. Perhaps we could discuss the new charitable foundation I'm launching. But his words were drowned out by another executive describing his company's recent successful diversity initiatives. Our profits increased by 30% after we restructured our hiring practices, the executive stated firmly. We found talent in places we'd never thought to look before, bringing fresh perspectives to old problems. Rebecca's pen moved faster. The story was writing itself, a gathering of elite business leaders confronting their biases in real time, sparked by an employer's failed attempt to humiliate his highly qualified employee. It was journalistic gold. Amanda, observing the room's dynamics shift, chose this moment to add her voice to the discussion. She stepped forward, her presence now commanding the same respect as any other guest. In my position, I've observed countless meetings through those doors, she gestured to the mansion's study. I've heard strategies discussed, deals made, and opportunities distributed. The common thread was always who knew whom, rather than who knew what. The silence that followed was deafening. Several guests glanced toward the study doors, perhaps remembering conversations they'd had there, suddenly aware of the witness they'd never considered. Rebecca moved closer, her journalist's instinct sensing a crucial moment. "Miss Clark, would you say this exemplifies a larger pattern in corporate America?" Before Amanda could respond, another guest spoke up, a woman who had built a successful tech startup. "I can answer that. Last year, I was told I'd have better luck finding investors if I hired a white man to pitch my company. I refused. It took longer to secure funding, but I wouldn't compromise my principles." Derek's complexion had grown increasingly pale. His attempts to change the subject had not only failed but had somehow sparked even more focused discussions about systemic inequality. He watched helplessly as Rebecca Chen documented everything, knowing tomorrow's business section would be very different from the simple society page coverage he'd expected. "The real question," Veronica interjected smoothly, "is what happens after tonight. Will this conversation lead to actual change, or will it be forgotten by tomorrow's board meetings?" Several executives immediately began sharing their business cards with Veronica and Amanda, making concrete plans for future consultations. The networking that Derek had intended to monopolize was happening without him, centered around the very person he'd tried to diminish. Rebecca Chen observed it all, her article taking shape in her mind. "Elite gathering becomes catalyst for corporate change." The subheading would write itself. Failed social power play sparks serious discussion on workplace diversity. The evening had transformed from a display of wealth and social hierarchy into something far more significant. Derek's carefully orchestrated show of power had become a platform for the very conversations he'd tried to avoid, and there was still more to come. The pivotal moment arrived when Amanda deliberately placed her serving tray on a nearby table, the soft clink of crystal drawing attention. The gesture was symbolic. She was no longer playing any role but her own. She moved to the center of the ballroom, her presence commanding in a way that made even the most distracted guests take notice. "If I may have everyone's attention," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. The room fell silent, not with the polite quiet afforded to wealth, but with the genuine stillness that accompanies authenticity. "For 6 years, I've worked in this mansion. I've served your drinks, coordinated your parties, and listened to your conversations about changing the world from your privileged positions." Derek moved to intervene, but James Morrison placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Let her speak," he muttered, his eyes fixed on Amanda. "Tonight, I was invited here as a guest, though the intention behind that invitation was far from hospitable." Amanda's gaze swept the room, making brief but meaningful eye contact with various guests. "Mr. Mills thought it would be amusing to watch me attempt to navigate your world. What he failed to realize is that I've been navigating it successfully for years, just from a different vantage point." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, many recognizing their own dismissive attitudes in Derek's actions. Rebecca Chen's pen never stopped moving, documenting every word of what was quickly becoming a defining moment in corporate social consciousness. "Each of you," Amanda continued, "has at some point expressed concern about diversity in your organizations. You've lamented the lack of qualified candidates from different backgrounds. Yet in your own homes, in your own offices, you overlook the potential right in front of you." She gestured to a young man serving champagne, the accountant she'd mentioned earlier. "Thomas there has a CPA and speaks 3 languages." She pointed to another server. "Maria is completing her master's in international business." Each revelation landed like a physical blow to the carefully constructed narrative of merit-based success. Derek's face had progressed from red to ashen. His attempt at humiliation had transformed into a masterclass in unconscious bias and missed opportunities. The wealthy guests who had arrived expecting an evening of self-congratulatory socializing found themselves confronted with their own complicity in maintaining systemic barriers. "Dignity," Amanda's voice grew stronger, "isn't determined by your job title or your bank account. It's not measured by the art on your walls or the car in your driveway. Dignity is inherent, and the moment you attempt to strip it from others, you reveal the bankruptcy of your own character." Several guests openly wiped tears from their eyes. A prominent tech CEO was nodding vigorously, already typing notes on his phone. The power dynamics in the room had shifted so dramatically that Derek found himself backing toward the edges, no longer the central figure in his own home. "I stand here not as an anomaly, but as a representative. For every one of me you see, there are thousands more, brilliant, capable individuals waiting for the opportunity to prove their worth. The question isn't whether we're qualified to enter your world." She paused, letting the tension build. "The question is whether your world is ready to acknowledge its need for us." The applause started slowly, a single pair of hands, then another, until it built into a thunderous ovation. It wasn't the polite clapping of society events, it was the genuine response to truth spoken plainly to power. Derek watched as his guests, people who had laughed at his jokes hours earlier, gave Amanda a standing ovation. His attempted display of social dominance had backfired spectacularly, becoming instead a catalyst for the very changes he'd resisted throughout his career. As the applause continued, Veronica stepped forward to stand beside Amanda, a physical representation of the bridge between worlds that needed to be built. The two women, each powerful in their own way, stood as living proof that dignity and success weren't bounded by social class or preconceptions. The aftermath of Amanda's speech transformed the ballroom into something entirely different from the usual social gatherings at the Mills mansion. Guests who had previously clustered in their familiar social circles now moved freely, engaging in earnest conversations with staff members they'd overlooked for years. Sarah Chen, CEO of a major pharmaceutical company, approached Maria, the server working on her international business degree. "I'd love to hear your thoughts on emerging markets in Southeast Asia," she said, handing Maria her business card. "My company is expanding there, and we need fresh perspectives." Across the room, Thomas, the CPA serving champagne, found himself in a detailed discussion about international tax law with 3 financial executives. His serving tray had been set aside, and he was sketching financial models on a napkin while the executives listened intently. Meanwhile, Rebecca Chen, the journalist, had positioned herself strategically to capture every interaction. Her article was evolving beyond a simple exposé of social inequality, it was becoming a real-time documentary of systemic change in action. "This is unprecedented," she murmured to Veronica, who had joined her for a moment of observation. "I've covered hundreds of these events, and I've never seen anything like this." "That's because most attempts at diversity and inclusion are carefully choreographed," Veronica replied. "This is raw, real, and impossible to ignore." Derek stood isolated near his prized Picasso, watching as his carefully cultivated social ecosystem reorganized itself without him at its center. His closest friends, people he'd played golf with for decades, were now earnestly exchanging contact information with members of his household staff. One particularly poignant moment occurred when an elderly board member, known for his conservative views, approached Amanda. "My granddaughter," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "has been trying to tell me these things for years. I didn't listen. I thought she was just young and idealistic. But seeing it, hearing it like this..." He paused, collecting himself. "Would you be willing to speak at our next board meeting?" Around the room, similar scenes played out. The barriers between servers and served, between employers and employees, had not so much broken down as revealed themselves to be illusions maintained by mutual agreement, an agreement that was now being consciously disbanded. Rebecca observed as groups formed and reformed, noting how the conversations had shifted from superficial social niceties to substantive discussions about corporate responsibility, hiring practices, and systemic change. Her notes captured snippets of transformation. "We need to completely revamp our hiring process. I never considered looking within our own support staff. Think of the talent we've been wasting." The staff members, initially hesitant to step out of their prescribed roles, gradually began sharing their stories, their dreams, their expertise. Each revelation added another crack to the facade of social hierarchy that Derek had so carefully maintained. James Morrison, still processing his earlier realizations, gathered a group of fellow executives. "We need to formalize this," he announced. "I'm proposing a consortium focused on identifying and developing talent from non-traditional backgrounds. Who's with me?" Hands raised immediately, commitments were made, and action items were set. What had started as Derek's attempt at social humiliation was becoming a catalyst for genuine institutional change. Through it all, Amanda and Veronica moved through the crowd strategically, connecting people, facilitating discussions, and ensuring that momentum wasn't lost in mere good intentions. They were building bridges in real time, turning an evening of intended embarrassment into a landmark moment of social transformation. Derek's attempts to restore the previous order grew increasingly desperate and ineffective. He tried announcing dinner, suggesting music, even attempting to draw attention to his art collection, but the gravitational center of the evening had shifted irreversibly. As Rebecca Chen documented everything, she realized she wasn't just covering a story, she was witnessing a paradigm shift in real time. The evening reached a critical point when Robert Sterling, Derek's oldest friend and chairman of a major banking conglomerate, stood up to address the room. His face was flushed, not from the expensive wine but from mounting conviction. "Derek," he called out, his voice cutting through the buzz of conversation. "We need to talk about your hiring practices." The room fell silent. Sterling was known for his direct approach, but this public confrontation was unprecedented. "For 20 years, I've watched you hire based on what you call cultural fit. Tonight has made me question everything about that culture." Derek attempted to deflect with a practiced smile. "Robert, perhaps this isn't the appropriate venue." "No," Sterling interrupted, his voice firm. "This is exactly the venue. I've sat on your company's board for 15 years. In that time, we've had exactly 0 diversity initiatives that weren't mandated by law. We've dismissed countless qualified candidates because they didn't fit your narrow definition of acceptable." The tension in the room was palpable. Amanda and Veronica exchanged glances. This unexpected ally was accelerating their timeline, but the momentum was undeniable. "Our shareholders' meeting is next month," Sterling continued, addressing both Derek and the room at large. "I'm proposing a complete overhaul of our hiring and promotion practices. And I'm not alone." He gestured to 3 other board members who stepped forward, nodding in agreement. Derek's face drained of color. "You can't." "We can and we will," another board member interjected. "The world is changing, Derek. Either we change with it, or we become obsolete." Amanda seized this moment to step forward with the initiative she'd been preparing. "I have a proposal," she announced, retrieving a document from her bag. "A comprehensive program for identifying and developing talent from underrepresented groups. It includes mentorship, educational support, and clear paths to advancement." The timing was perfect. As Derek watched in horror, his board members gathered around Amanda, examining her proposal with genuine interest. His attempt to humiliate her had instead positioned her as a thought leader in front of the very people who could implement real change. Veronica added her voice to the discussion. "My company would be willing to partner in this initiative. We've implemented similar programs with remarkable success. The return on investment in terms of innovation and market expansion has been extraordinary." The energy in the room shifted again, from theoretical discussion to practical action. Executive after executive stepped forward, offering resources, connections, and commitments. What had started as a confrontation about Derek's practices was evolving into a coalition for change. Rebecca Chen, still documenting everything, watched as Derek's power base eroded in real time. His usual allies were now actively working against his established order, inspired by the very person he'd tried to diminish. "We need to establish concrete metrics," one CEO announced. "Measurable goals for inclusion at every level of our organizations. And accountability," another added. "Real consequences for failing to meet these goals." The crowd that had gathered around Amanda's proposal grew larger. Even the serving staff, seeing their colleagues engaged in reshaping corporate policy, began cautiously joining the discussion, offering insights from their unique perspectives. Derek made one last attempt to reassert control. "This is my house," he began, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "This is my party." "No, Derek," Sterling cut him off. "This stopped being your party the moment you tried to use it as a weapon against someone who proved to be far more valuable to our business community than your outdated attitudes." The statement hung in the air, a public rebuke that would have been unthinkable hours earlier. Amanda stood tall, her original mission accomplished beyond her wildest expectations. What had been planned as an evening of subtle resistance had catalyzed into a movement for genuine institutional change. Derek's desperation became increasingly evident as he watched his social and professional world unravel. Making his way to the center of the room, he attempted one final power play. "This is ridiculous," he announced, his voice strained. "You're all being manipulated by a servant who got lucky with one speech." The silence that followed was deafening. Several guests physically stepped back from him, creating a visible circle of isolation. The word servant hung in the air like a testament to everything that needed to change. "A servant." Veronica's voice was razor-sharp. "Amanda holds a master's degree from Columbia. She's published research on organizational psychology. The only thing that makes her a servant is your insistence on seeing her that way." James Morrison stepped forward, addressing the room rather than Derek. "I've just been reviewing my company's hiring data on my phone. In the past decade, we've rejected over 300 candidates from non-traditional backgrounds despite their qualifications. That stops tonight. Derek's attempted interjection was drowned out by a wave of similar declarations from other executives. The movement was taking on a life of its own, with concrete commitments being made in real time. The most damning thing, a venture capitalist observed, is that we're all complicit. We've attended parties like this for years, being served by people whose potential we never bothered to notice. How many opportunities have we wasted? How much talent have we ignored? Rebecca Chen's fingers flew across her phone, capturing every detail. The story had evolved from a society page scandal to a seismic shift in corporate culture. She watched as Derek tried to move through the crowd, only to find himself increasingly isolated as guests deliberately turned away. Amanda observed his isolation with a complex mix of emotions. This wasn't about revenge, it was about transformation. Yet watching Derek's desperate attempts to maintain his status quo served as a perfect illustration of why change was so necessary. "Your art collection is impressive, Derek," one of his former golf buddies called out, voice dripping with new understanding. "But you've been treating people like decorations for too long." The statement sparked a fresh wave of discussions about objectification in corporate culture. Guests began sharing stories of their own biases, their own mistakes, their own moments of treating people as background scenery rather than human beings with potential. Derek made one last attempt to salvage his position. "This is all very noble," he said, forcing a condescending smile, "but business is business. The bottom line has been suffering because of attitudes like yours," a CFO interrupted. "Do you know what diversity of thought brings to innovation? To problem solving? To market understanding? We've been limiting our own success by limiting our vision of who belongs in the boardroom." The room had transformed completely. The elegant flower arrangements and expensive artwork now seemed like hollow attempts at sophistication compared to the authentic exchanges happening between guests of all backgrounds. Amanda caught Veronica's eye across the room. Their plan had succeeded beyond their expectations. Derek's isolation wasn't just social, it was becoming professional. His attempt to showcase his power had instead revealed its fragility. As Derek retreated to the edges of his own party, Amanda allowed herself a small smile. The real victory wasn't in his humiliation, but in the genuine connections being forged, the commitments being made, and the change being set in motion. The gala was winding down, but the energy in the room remained electric with possibility. As guests began gathering their coats, the conversations had shifted from pledges of change to concrete plans for implementation. Business cards were exchanged not as social currency, but as promises of future collaboration. Derek stood near the grand staircase, a solitary figure in his own home. The evening's transformation had left him looking somehow diminished, his usual commanding presence replaced by an almost palpable uncertainty. One of his oldest friends, Michael Bennett, approached him with a gravity that suggested an uncomfortable conversation ahead. "Derek," Michael began, his voice low but firm, "we've known each other for 30 years. We've sat on boards together, played golf together, watched our kids grow up together. But tonight..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Tonight made me ashamed of how many times I've laughed at your jokes about the help, how many times I've been complicit in maintaining this artificial hierarchy." Derek attempted to interrupt, but Michael held up his hand. "Let me finish. Tomorrow morning, I'm calling an emergency board meeting at Bennett Global. We need to re-evaluate our entire corporate culture. And Derek, I think you need to do the same." The suggestion hung in the air like a verdict. Derek's face tightened. "You're lecturing me about corporate culture? In my own home?" "Your home," Michael replied, "where you invited a highly qualified professional to attend a party with the explicit intention of humiliating her. Think about that, Derek. Really think about what that says about your leadership." Around them, the remaining guests were forming small groups, making plans for follow-up meetings and initiatives. Amanda and Veronica stood at the center of several of these discussions, their presence now commanding the respect that had always been their due. Derek watched as another longtime friend approached him, then veered away at the last moment to join a conversation with Amanda instead. The isolation was becoming not just social, but professionally threatening. His position on several boards, his invitations to exclusive events, his entire carefully constructed world of influence, all of it seemed to be slipping away. "Perhaps," he attempted, his voice lacking its usual confidence, "we could discuss some gradual changes to our hiring practices." "Gradual?" Michael's response was sharp. That's the problem, Derek. We've been gradual for decades. Tonight showed us what we've been missing because of that approach. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages. 3 major investment firms have already committed to Amanda's initiative. Veronica's team is drafting implementation plans. The world is moving forward, with or without you. As if to emphasize his point, Rebecca Chen chose that moment to conclude her last interview of the evening, with Amanda's former supervisor from her graduate program at Columbia. The professor had arrived late but added crucial academic validation to Amanda's proposals. Derek watched helplessly as the last vestiges of his social power structure crumbled. The very people he'd counted on to maintain the status quo were now actively working to dismantle it. Amanda, observing from across the room, felt no triumph in Derek's obvious distress. This evening had never been about revenge. It was about creating change, about opening doors that had been deliberately kept closed for too long. As the final guests prepared to leave, the contrast between the evening's beginning and end couldn't have been starker. What had started as an attempt to reinforce social hierarchies had ended in their dramatic dissolution. The mansion's grand rooms, which had earlier showcased Derek's wealth and power, now felt like a museum to an outdated way of thinking. The evening's final revelation unfolded like a carefully orchestrated crescendo. Rebecca Chen, who had been documenting the night's events, stepped forward just as the last guests were preparing to leave. She placed her notebook deliberately on a nearby table and walked to the center of the room. Before everyone departs, she announced, her journalist's voice carrying clearly, there's one more story that needs to be told. She turned to face Amanda. Would you like to tell them, or shall I? Amanda smiled, a mixture of strength and serenity in her expression. Go ahead, sis. The single word, sis, echoed through the room like a thunderclap. Derek, who had been nursing his wounded pride near the staircase, jerked his head up in shock. The remaining guests froze, their departure temporarily forgotten. Rebecca's professional demeanor softened as she addressed the room. Yes, Amanda is my sister. While I was adopted by a wealthy family and given every opportunity, Amanda chose a different path. She wanted to understand the system from the inside, to effect change from the ground up. The revelation rippled through the assembly. Guests who had been present for the entire evening now reassessed everything they'd witnessed with this new understanding. Amanda's powerful speech, her carefully planned initiatives, her partnership with Veronica, it was all part of a larger strategy. For the past 6 years, Rebecca continued, I've been documenting stories of qualified professionals trapped in service positions due to systemic barriers. Amanda's experience here, working for Mr. Mills, became a case study in how privilege perpetuates itself. Derek stumbled forward, his face ashen. You've been investigating me. No, Derek, Amanda replied calmly. We've been investigating a system. You just happen to be a perfect example of it. Veronica stepped forward, completing the triangle of women who had orchestrated the evening's transformation. When Amanda shared her observations with me 2 years ago, I recognized an opportunity to challenge the status quo. Tonight wasn't about humiliating you, Derek. It was about exposing the absurdity of judging human worth by social position. Rebecca opened her notebook one last time. Tomorrow's article won't just be about tonight. It's going to be a series about hidden talent in America's workforce, about artificial barriers and missed opportunities. Amanda's story, our story, is just the beginning. The remaining guests stood in stunned silence as the full implications became clear. This hadn't been a simple reversal of social dynamics, it had been a carefully planned catalyst for systemic change, documented and ready to be shared with the world. Derek sank onto the bottom step of his grand staircase, the weight of understanding finally hitting him. His attempt to humiliate a servant had instead exposed his own prejudices to the world. Worse, it had been recorded, analyzed, and would soon be published in one of the country's most respected newspapers. Your invitation to me tonight, Amanda said, addressing him directly for the first time since her speech, was meant to be a reminder of my place in your world. Instead, it became a demonstration of how much that world needs to change. The final guests departed not with the usual social pleasantries but with commitments to action, contact information exchanged, and plans for follow-up meetings. The story would continue beyond this night, beyond these walls, into boardrooms and hiring offices across the country. As Amanda, Rebecca, and Veronica prepared to leave, they paused in the doorway. Behind them, Derek remained on the stairs, a portrait of privilege confronted by its own limitations. Before him stretched a future where his power and position would no longer be enough to maintain the barriers he'd taken for granted. The three women shared a glance of quiet triumph. They had come seeking change and had achieved something far more profound, the beginning of a movement. As they walked out into the night, leaving Derek alone in his mansion full of expensive art and shattered assumptions, they carried with them the certainty that tomorrow would bring new conversations, new opportunities, and new possibilities for those who had been waiting too long for their chance to shine. The evening had ended, but its impact was just beginning.